was 31 years old. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 31, an age when most men are just beginning to understand their own power, an age when the greatest chapters of a life are still unwritten. Rudolph Valentino was 31 years old when he died on August 23, 1926, and the world collapsed. But here is what history has quietly allowed you to forget. Here is the detail that every studio biography, every sanitized Hollywood retrospective, every carefully managed obituary worked to keep buried beneath flowers and grief and manufactured tears. Rudolph Valentino did not simply die. He was consumed. He was consumed by a system built by men who looked at the greatest screen idol the world had ever produced and saw not a human being, but a revenue stream, a product, a machine for generating box office receipts that needed to keep running until it broke. And when it broke, when Rudolph Valentino collapsed onto a hospital bed in New York City with a perforated gastric ulcer and pleuritis tearing through his body, the men responsible were not standing at his bedside. They were not in the hospital. They were not even in the same city. Adolf Zucker was running Paramount Pictures. Jesse Lasky was running Paramount Pictures. And Paramount Pictures had scheduled Rudolph Valentino for a publicity tour despite the fact that every person who looked at him could see that he was not well. His hands trembled. His complexion had grayed. He had lost weight that a man of his build could not afford to lose. The warning signs were not subtle. They were written across his body in plain sight, and the studio read them, calculated the tour revenue against the risk, and sent him anyway. This was not an accident. This was Paramount's calculated negligence dressed in the language of show business obligation. They called it a promotional tour, a necessary appearance, a contractual requirement. They gave it every name except the name it deserved, a death sentence. Now, you may ask how a studio could do this to the most beloved screen idol in the world. You may ask why no one stopped it, why no doctor intervened, why no union existed to protect him, why the newspapers that adored Valentino in life did not ask a single hard question about the conditions that destroyed him. The answer to every one of those questions is the same answer, and it is the most important thing this channel will ever tell you. Hollywood in 1926 was not an entertainment industry. It was a factory. And in a factory, the product does not get to be tired. The product does not get to be sick. The product does not get to say no. The product runs until it stops running, and when it stops, the factory finds a replacement and re-releases the last thing the old product made. Within weeks of Rudolph Valentino's death, Paramount re-released Son of the Sheik, the film that had finished him. They held the premiere. They sold the tickets. They counted the money. They sent flowers to his funeral. The same hands that signed the contracts that killed him sent flowers to his funeral. And the newspapers printed photographs of those flowers and called it mourning. It was not mourning. It was the final transaction. Rudolph Valentino trusted the machine. The machine worked him to death. And then it monetized the corpse. To understand how this happened, to understand every decision, every contract, every ignored warning sign, every deliberate cruelty that built toward that hospital room in August 1926, we must start at the very beginning. We must start in a small village in the south of Italy, in the year 1895, where a boy was born who had no idea that one day the most powerful entertainment corporation in the world would decide exactly how much his life was worth. They calculated it. They wrote the number down, and the number was not enough. Castellaneta. If you have never heard of it, that is exactly the point. Castellaneta is a small hilltop town in the Puglia region of southern Italy, a place so remote, so forgotten by the industrialized world of the late 19th century, that its name does not appear in a single Hollywood biography written during Rudolph Valentino's lifetime. The studio did not want you to know where he came from. Poverty does not sell romance. Hunger does not sell glamour. A boy who grew up with dirt floors and uncertain meals does not fit the myth of the exotic, effortless Latin lover that Paramount Pictures later manufactured and sold to the world. But Castellaneta is where the truth begins. On May 6, 1895, Rodolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pietro Filiberto Guglielmi was born to Giovanni Guglielmi and Gabrielle Barbin. His father was a veterinarian, not wealthy, but respectable enough to keep the family one step above genuine destitution. His mother was French-born, educated, and possessed of a ferocious belief that her children deserved more than the crumbling south of Italy was prepared to offer them. That belief would cost her everything, and it would forge her son into something extraordinary. Giovanni Guglielmi died in 1906. Rodolfo was 11 years old. 11 years old, and the floor disappeared. Without his father's income, the family's fragile stability collapsed instantly. His mother, Gabrielle, fought to keep the household together with the particular desperation of a woman who refuses to surrender. But the south of Italy in the early 20th century offered a widow with children almost nothing. No safety net, no institutional support, no mercy from the economic machinery grinding poor families into dust. Young Rodolfo watched his mother fight. He watched her sacrifice, and something hardened inside him, not bitterness, but purpose. A burning, restless, furious purpose that would define every decision he made for the rest of his short life. He was not a passive child waiting for rescue. He never waited for anything. He threw himself into education with the intensity of someone who understood, even at that age, that knowledge was the only ladder available to him. He read voraciously. He studied agriculture at the Dante Alighieri College in Genoa, not because he loved farming, but because it was the education his family could access. He learned to dance. He learned French from his mother. He observed people with a precision that bordered on obsession. He was preparing for something. He did not yet know what. By the time he was 17, Castellaneta could no longer contain him. The town was too small. The options were too few. The world outside was too loud in his imagination to be ignored any longer. He convinced his mother, through a campaign of sustained, passionate argument that would have impressed any courtroom lawyer, to fund a journey to Paris. Paris broke him. He arrived with ambitions and left with nothing. The city consumed his money, his confidence, and his plan without offering anything in return. He worked briefly as a gardener. He performed odd jobs. He slept in places that did not deserve the word accommodation. But here is what Rudolph Valentino did not do in Paris. He did not quit. He did not write home asking to be rescued. He did not accept that the world had correctly identified his ceiling and sit down beneath it. He recalibrated. He pivoted. He chose a new direction with the same total commitment he brought to everything. And he turned his eyes toward America. Not because America promised him safety. Not because America promised him comfort, but because America, specifically New York City in 1913, promised him scale. The scale of possibility that a man with his hunger and his talent and his absolute refusal to be ordinary could not find anywhere else on earth. He was 18 years old. He had almost no money. He had no connections. He had no plan beyond arrival. He boarded the ship anyway. That is who Rudolph Valentino was before Hollywood ever touched him. Before the contracts, before the cameras, before Adolf Zücker decided what he was worth. He was a self-made force of nature who had already survived more loss by the age of 18 than most men encounter in a lifetime. The machine did not create him. The machine only destroyed him. He arrived in New York in December 1913 with approximately $4 in his pocket. $4, not 400, not 4,000. $4, the total financial foundation upon which Rodolfo Guglielmi intended to build a life in the most brutal, indifferent, magnificent city on earth. New York in 1913 did not care about your ambitions. New York in 1913 did not care about the fire in your chest, or the talent in your hands, or the desperate intelligence behind your eyes. New York in 1913 processed immigrants by the thousands every single week, ground them through its machinery, extracted whatever labor it could, and discarded the ones who broke before they could establish themselves. Rodolfo Guglielmi refused to be discarded, but the city made him pay for that refusal every single day. He could not speak fluent English. He had no family in America. He had no professional connections, no letters of introduction, no safety net of any kind. What he had was his body, his mind, his extraordinary capacity for observation, and $4 that would be gone within days of his arrival. He found work as a gardener for a wealthy Long Island estate. The work was physical, exhausting, and utterly beneath the ambitions burning inside him, but he did it. He did it without complaint and without self-pity, because a man who watched his widowed mother hold a household together on nothing had no patience for the luxury of self-pity. When the gardening work dried up, he found other work. Busboy, dishwasher. He scrubbed plates in restaurant kitchens while outside those kitchen windows, New York's wealthy classes ate and laughed and moved through the world with the casual ease of people who had never once wondered where their next meal was coming from. He watched them through the steam and the noise. He studied them. He filed every detail away. Then he discovered the taxi dance halls. In the taxi dance halls of New York City, establishments where men paid 10 cents per dance for a few minutes with a professional dance partner, Rudolpho Guglielmi found the first intersection of his talent and an income. He could dance. He had always been able to dance with a fluency and a grace that stopped people mid-conversation to watch him. In the dance halls, that ability became currency. He was not ashamed of it. He should not have been. A man using every tool available to him to survive in a city that offered him nothing is not a man to be pitied. He is a man to be respected. But New York's newspapers, the same newspapers that would later eulogize him in thundering prose, would use those dance hall years as ammunition, as evidence of foreignness, as proof that he did not quite belong in the elevated world of American stardom. The humiliation was deliberate, and it was only the beginning of a lifetime of deliberate humiliation at the hands of powerful men who feared what Rudolph Valentino represented. He drifted into the fringes of New York's theatrical world. He took small roles in musical productions. He performed wherever a stage existed, and someone was willing to let an Italian immigrant with $4 and limitless determination stand on it. He absorbed technique. He studied movement. He watched actors with the forensic intensity of someone who understood that observation itself is a form of education. And then his New York chapter ended, not with triumph, but with scandal. In 1915, Valentino became entangled in a messy criminal case involving a woman named Bianca de Salles. The details were sordid, the accusations were damaging, and though Valentino was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, his name had been dragged through enough New York mud that the city felt suddenly small and hostile. He made the only decision that made sense. He headed west, toward Los Angeles, toward the film industry that was still young enough, still raw enough, still hungry enough to give a man with no connections and everything to prove a fighting chance. He did not know that the city waiting for him at the end of that journey contained men who had already perfected the machinery of exploitation. Men who had spent years building a system specifically designed to find talent exactly like his, raw, desperate, unprotected, and extract every dollar of value from it before discarding the human being it came attached to. Adolf Zucker was already waiting. The trap was already built. Rodolfo Guglielmi just did not know it yet. Los Angeles in 1917 was a city in the middle of becoming something monstrous. The film industry had migrated west from New York barely a decade earlier. Drawn by the reliable California sunlight, the cheap land, and the convenient distance from the Edison Trust's patent enforcers, who had been strangling independent filmmakers on the East Coast. By the time Rodolfo Guglielmi stepped off the train and into the warm Pacific air, Hollywood was no longer a scrappy collection of independent dreamers. It was consolidating, corporatizing. The studios were building walls around their power, and the men at the top were writing rules that would govern every human being unfortunate enough to depend on them for a living. Valentino did not walk into opportunity. He walked into a carefully constructed cage, and in 1917, the cage was still dressed up beautifully enough to look like a door. He found work immediately. That much is true. But the work he found was the work Hollywood reserved for people it had not yet decided to care about. Extra roles, background appearances, fleeting moments on screen that lasted seconds and paid almost nothing. He played villains. He played foreigners. He played the shadowy, vaguely threatening Latin presence that American cinema in 1917 needed to populate its darker corners. He did it without complaint. He showed up. He learned. He watched the directors, the cinematographers, the established actors moving through the studio system with the practiced ease of people who understood its machinery. He studied every frame of every production he appeared in. He was not simply working. He was preparing. And the preparation was visible to everyone except the people with the power to act on it. Directors noticed that Valentino moved differently from other actors. In an era when screen performance still carried the broad theatrical gestures of the stage, Valentino was doing something that the camera rewarded with almost shocking generosity. He was being still. He was allowing his face to carry the weight of emotion rather than performing it with his entire body. He understood instinctively, without anyone teaching him, that the camera was an intimacy machine, not a stage, and that the actors who treated it as such would be the ones it loved. The camera loved Rudolph Valentino from the very beginning. But love from a camera means nothing if the men controlling the cameras refuse to see it. For 3 years, Valentino moved through Hollywood's lower tiers, accumulating credits that built a foundation but not a career, attracting attention from everyone except the decision-makers who could have elevated him years earlier. He took every role offered. He never turned down work. He lived frugally, studied obsessively, and maintained the same relentless forward momentum that had carried him from Castellaneta to Paris to New York to Los Angeles without ever allowing him the dangerous luxury of stopping. Then June Mathis saw him. June Mathis was one of the most powerful screenwriters in Hollywood, a woman who had fought her way to genuine creative authority in an industry that granted creative authority to women almost never. She was brilliant, unconventional, and possessed of a talent for identifying screen presence that bordered on supernatural. She had been tasked with adapting the sprawling World War I novel The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse for Metro Pictures, a massive, expensive production that needed a lead actor capable of carrying its emotional and physical demands. Everyone in Hollywood had a suggestion. Every suggestion was safe. Every suggestion was predictable. Every suggestion was wrong. June Mathis watched Rudolph Valentino move across a room at a party. She watched him for approximately 30 seconds. Then she told Metro Pictures she had found their star. The studio executives looked at her choice, an Italian immigrant with no star credits, a complicated past in New York, and a face that defied every conventional standard of American masculine beauty, and they expressed serious reservations. June Mathis did not negotiate with their reservations. She overrode them. She was right to do so. She was completely, historically, undeniably right. And the tragedy, one of the many tragedies threaded through this story, is that June Mathis, the woman who saw Rudolph Valentino clearly when no one else would receive almost none of the credit for what happened next. What happened next was the moment everything changed. What happened next was the moment the machine finally noticed what it had accidentally been sitting on for 3 years and decided it wanted all of it. Production on The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse began in 1920. The world that existed on the other side of that film, the world that would greet its release in 1921, would never look at Rudolph Valentino the same way again. Neither would Adolf Zucker, and that was when the real danger began. The apocalypse opened on March 6, 1921. By March 7, the world had a new obsession. The film was a phenomenon by any measure. A sweeping, emotionally devastating adaptation that cost Metro Pictures enormous sums and returned those sums many times over at the box office. It became one of the highest-grossing films of the silent era. Critics exhausted their vocabulary trying to describe its scale, its ambition, its technical achievement. But the reviews kept returning to one thing: one person, one face, Rudolph Valentino. The tango sequence alone, 3 minutes of Valentino moving across a screen with a physicality and a sensuality that American cinema had never seen before, produced reactions in audiences that bordered on the physiological. Women wept. Women fainted. Women returned to see the film again and again and again, not for the story, not for the spectacle, but for the 3 minutes when Rudolph Valentino looked directly into the camera and made every single person watching feel, for one breathtaking moment, that he was looking directly at them. That is not a performance technique. That is not something that can be taught in an acting class or manufactured by a studio publicity department. That is a gift so rare that entire generations of filmmakers spend their careers searching for it and never find it. Valentino had it completely, naturally, effortlessly. Metro Pictures understood immediately what they had, but it was Paramount Pictures, specifically Adolf Zucker and Jesse Lasky, the architects of the most powerful studio in Hollywood, who moved fastest to acquire it. Before the year was finished, Valentino had signed with Paramount. Before the ink was dry on that contract, Paramount had scheduled his next production. And the production after that. And the production after that. The machine had identified its most valuable asset. Now it intended to extract maximum value from that asset with maximum speed and minimum expenditure on the asset's well-being. But first, the ascent had one more peak to reach. The Sheik opened in November 1921. If the Four Horsemen made Valentino a star, the Sheik made him a religion. The film was, by any serious cinematic standard, a deeply problematic fantasy built on Orientalist stereotypes and colonial wish fulfillment. History must acknowledge that honestly. But what history must also acknowledge is what Valentino did inside that flawed framework. He took a character that existed on the page as a prop, an exotic, dangerous, masculine fantasy, and breathed into it a vulnerability, a longing, a complexity that the source material had never intended and that the studio had never requested. He gave the character a soul. He did it anyway. That was who he was. The public response was unlike anything Hollywood had witnessed. Women did not simply enjoy the Sheik. They organized themselves around it. Fan clubs formed overnight. Letters arrived at Paramount by the thousands, then the tens of thousands. Women named their children after the character. Women wrote to Valentino with a personal intensity that blurred every line between performer and performance. The Sheik generated more fan mail than any film in Hollywood history to that point. Paramount counted every letter. Paramount understood exactly what each letter represented in box office terms. Paramount responded to this extraordinary outpouring of human devotion directed at Rudolph Valentino by doing what Paramount always did. They scheduled more films. Faster, with less recovery time between productions, with less creative input from the man whose talent was generating all of this, with less money than his box office returns justified, with contracts that bound him more tightly with every signing. But the cultural reaction to Valentino was not universally worship. And the opposition that formed against him, the particular, ugly, gendered opposition, would be weaponized against him by the very studio that profited from his image. American men, broadly speaking, did not know what to do with Rudolph Valentino. He was foreign. He was sensual. He moved with a grace that American masculinity in the 1920s had decided belonged exclusively to women. He made women feel things that their husbands and boyfriends demonstrably did not make them feel. And that fact produced in a certain category of American man a rage that had nothing to do with cinema and everything to do with insecurity. The editorial pages noticed. The editorial pages fed the insecurity. And Paramount, watching all of this with cold corporate attention, filed away the knowledge that public opinion about Rudolph Valentino could be shaped, could be directed, could be turned, if necessary, into a weapon. They did not deploy that weapon yet. In 1921, Valentino was too valuable to damage, but they remembered. Paramount always remembered. He was at the absolute peak of his power. He was the most recognized face on Earth. He was 30 years old, extraordinarily talented, burning with creative ambitions that the studio was already systematically denying him. And he was completely, legally, contractually trapped. The most beloved man in the world was trapped. And the men who built the trap were already calculating exactly how much they could extract from him before the trap killed him. The calculation had already begun. To understand what Paramount Pictures did to Rudolph Valentino, you must first understand what Paramount Pictures was, not what it claimed to be. Not the glamorous mythology it constructed around itself in press releases and studio portraits and carefully managed newspaper profiles. What it actually was, what it was built to do, what it optimized for with every contract it wrote, every decision it made, every human being it processed through its machinery. Paramount Pictures in the early 1920s was not an entertainment company. It was a vertically integrated extraction operation disguised as an entertainment company. Adolf Zücker built it that way deliberately. Zücker had arrived in America from Hungary in 1888, an immigrant story not entirely unlike Valentino's own, a fact that makes his later treatment of Valentino not ironic but revealing. Zücker understood what it meant to arrive with nothing. He understood hunger and ambition and the burning need to establish oneself in a country that did not automatically welcome you. He had felt all of those things. And he had decided that the correct response to having felt them was to build a system that extracted maximum profit from everyone who felt them after him. He was not sentimental about this. He was not conflicted about it. Adolf Zücker looked at the film industry in the early 20th century and saw, with the cold clarity of a genuinely brilliant corporate architect, exactly how it could be structured to concentrate power and money at the top. In his hands, in the hands of the men he trusted, away from the artists who actually created the product that generated all of it. Jesse Lasky was his partner in this construction. Lasky was the public face, smoother, more charming, more comfortable performing warmth for the cameras, while Zücker was the structural mind, the man who understood contracts and leverage and the precise amount of dependency that needed to be engineered into every relationship the studio maintained with its talent. Together, they built the machine, and the machine had three components that worked in perfect, devastating coordination. The first component was vertical integration. Paramount did not simply produce films. Paramount owned the theaters that showed those films. Paramount controlled the distribution networks that moved those films from studio to screen. This meant that a film Paramount produced would play in Paramount theaters, distributed by Paramount networks, with every dollar of profit flowing back to Paramount at every stage of the process. Independent theater owners who refused to show Paramount films found themselves systematically frozen out of the best product in the industry. It was not competition, it was suffocation. The second component was the star system. Paramount understood, before almost anyone else in the industry understood it with such clarity, that audiences did not simply buy tickets to films. They bought tickets to people. They came back again and again for specific faces, specific presences, specific emotional experiences that only certain performers could provide. This meant that those performers had an extraordinary amount of latent power. It also meant that controlling those performers, owning their image, their time, their creative output, their very public identity, was the single most important business priority the studio had. Stars were not employees at Paramount. They were not creative partners. They were not human beings whose talent the studio had the privilege of presenting to the world. They were assets. They were inventory. They were product to be manufactured, packaged, marketed, and monetized with the same emotional detachment that a steel company applies to its raw materials. The third component was the contract system, and this is where the machine revealed its true genius and its true brutality. Paramount's contracts were engineered documents. They were not agreements between parties with roughly equivalent power. They were instruments of total control, written by Paramount's lawyers, reviewed by Paramount's lawyers, and signed by performers who either had no legal representation capable of matching Paramount's legal firepower or who were desperate enough, hungry enough, ambitious enough, frightened enough of losing the opportunity to sign without fully understanding what they were surrendering. What they were surrendering was everything. Script approval. Gone. The studio decided what films a contracted star would appear in, regardless of the star's creative judgment, artistic values, or physical capacity to perform them. Salary negotiation. Gone. The studio set the rate. The studio adjusted the rate when it chose to. The star accepted the rate or faced suspension, an unpaid suspension that still bound them to the contract and prevented them from working elsewhere. Rest periods. Non-existent. The concept of mandatory recovery time between productions, a basic acknowledgement that human bodies have physical limits, did not appear in Paramount contracts because acknowledging physical limits would have introduced inefficiency into the extraction process. Right of refusal. Eliminated. A star who refused a role faced suspension, public humiliation, and the very real threat of being labeled difficult. A label the studio's press connections would spread through every entertainment publication in America within days. This was the machine that Rudolph Valentino signed himself into in 1921. He trusted it, because it offered him everything he had crossed an ocean and survived years of poverty and humiliation to reach. He trusted it because he had no reason yet to understand what trusting it would cost him. The machine had been waiting for someone exactly like him. It had him now. Let us talk about the document, not in general terms. not in the comfortable, vague language that Hollywood biographies use when they want to acknowledge exploitation without naming it directly. Let us talk about what Rudolph Valentino's contract with Paramount Pictures actually meant in forensic detail, clause by clause, consequence by consequence, because the document that bound him to that studio was not a business agreement. It was a legal cage. And every bar of that cage was designed by men who understood exactly what they were building. When Valentino signed with Paramount in 1921, he entered an arrangement that gave the studio control over virtually every professional decision of his life. The contract specified which films he would make. It specified when he would make them. It specified the rate at which he would be compensated, a rate that Paramount set unilaterally, and that bore almost no relationship to the revenues his films were generating for the studio. Consider the arithmetic for a moment. The Sheik cost Paramount approximately $200,000 to produce. It returned over $1 million at the box office in its initial release alone, and that figure does not include the secondary revenues from re-releases, international distribution, or the explosion of merchandise that Paramount's licensing division monetized with aggressive efficiency. The ratio of Valentino's personal compensation to the wealth his image generated for the studio was not a ratio. It was an insult rendered in contractual language. But the financial exploitation, as outrageous as it was not the most dangerous element of what Paramount built into that contract. The most dangerous element was the schedule. Paramount scheduled Rudolph Valentino's productions with the systematic intensity of a factory manager optimizing an assembly line. The logic was straightforward and completely devoid of any consideration for the human being at its center. Valentino's films made money. More Valentino films would make more money. Therefore, Valentino would make more films faster, with less preparation time, with less recovery time between productions, with less creative development invested in each project, because speed maximized output and output maximized revenue. Between 1921 and 1923, Paramount pushed Valentino through 5 major productions. 5 films in 2 years, each one requiring not simply the physical act of filming, exhausting enough on its own, but the elaborate surrounding machinery of costume fittings, publicity appearances, press interviews, studio photographs, public appearances, and the relentless performance of stardom that the studio demanded of him around the clock, not simply on set. He was not given time to recover between productions. The concept was not in the contract because the concept did not serve Paramount's interests, and Paramount's contracts contained nothing that did not serve Paramount's interests. He was not given script approval. This was a cruelty that went beyond the financial. Valentino was a man of genuine artistic intelligence, a performer who thought deeply about character, about movement, about the specific emotional truth he wanted to deliver to an audience. He had opinions, he had standards, he had a clear and sophisticated understanding of what elevated a film above mere product and made it something that mattered. Paramount did not want his opinions. Paramount wanted his face. Paramount wanted his body on screen in whatever vehicle the studio's production department had determined would generate the maximum return. His artistic judgment was not an asset to be cultivated. It was an inconvenience to be managed. The right of refusal did not exist in his contract. If Paramount assigned him a role, he played it. If Paramount assigned him a production schedule, he kept it. If Paramount decided that the appropriate gap between the end of one film and the beginning of the next was 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, or 1 week, then 3 weeks or 2 weeks or 1 week was what Rudolph Valentino received, regardless of what his body required, regardless of what his creative instincts demanded, regardless of what any reasonable standard of human decency would have suggested. And embedded within all of this, the financial exploitation, the creative suppression, the punishing schedule, was the cruelest clause of all: the exclusivity provision. Valentino was legally prohibited from working for any other studio. He could not accept outside projects. He could not develop independent productions. He could not take his talent, the breathtaking, irreplaceable, genuinely historic talent that was generating millions of dollars for Paramount Pictures, and offer it to any other entity that might treat it with greater respect or compensate it with greater fairness. He was owned, not employed. Owned, If he refused a role, Paramount suspended him without pay. The suspension did not pause the contract, it extended it. Every day of suspension added a day to the total duration of his contractual obligation. Refusing to comply did not bring him closer to freedom. It pushed freedom further away while simultaneously cutting off his income. The trap had no exit built into it. That was the point. Adolf Zukor did not design this system carelessly. Jesse Lasky did not allow these terms to appear in a contract through oversight. Every clause was intentional. Every restriction was calculated. Every provision that stripped Valentino of agency, of creative control, of fair compensation, of basic human consideration. Every single one of those provisions was placed in that document by lawyers working for men who understood precisely what they were doing. They built a machine that extracted everything from the people trapped inside it, and Rudolph Valentino was trapped inside it. For now. For now. Every machine has a breaking point. And in 1923, Rudolph Valentino found his. The immediate cause was a film called The Spanish Dancer. Paramount had assigned it to him without consultation, without negotiation, without the most basic professional courtesy of asking whether the man whose face would carry the entire production had any thoughts about it whatsoever. The script was weak. The role was a retreat, a recycling of the exotic Latin lover template that Paramount had already stamped onto him without his consent and that he had been privately, desperately trying to expand beyond. Valentino refused. Let that moment sit with you. Because it took extraordinary courage, not the romantic, cinematic kind of courage, but the cold, practical, terrifying kind, for Rudolph Valentino to look at the most powerful studio in Hollywood and say no. He understood what the word would cost him. He understood the contractual consequences. He understood that Paramount's publicity machine, the same apparatus that had built his image from nothing, possessed the industrial capacity to dismantle that image with equal efficiency. He understood that no union existed to stand beside him, that no regulatory body would intervene on his behalf, that the legal system had been carefully navigated by Paramount's lawyers to ensure that every legitimate avenue of resistance had been closed before he ever thought to try it. He said no anyway. Paramount's response was immediate, total, and deliberately brutal. They suspended him, without pay, publicly. They made certain that every entertainment publication in America understood that Rudolph Valentino, the most beloved screen idol in the world, had been suspended by Paramount Pictures for breach of contract. They framed his refusal not as the legitimate artistic and professional objection of a man who had been systematically exploited for 2 years, but as the petulant tantrum of a difficult, ungrateful foreign star who did not understand how fortunate he was to be working at all. The press, which in 1923 maintained a relationship with the major studios that was less journalism and more managed dependency, largely accepted Paramount's framing and printed it. But then something happened that Paramount had not fully calculated for. The public did not accept it. The fan response to Valentino's suspension was not the quiet acquiescence that Paramount had expected. Letters poured in, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands. Women who had made Paramount wealthy beyond any reasonable projection by purchasing tickets to Rudolph Valentino films expressed their feelings about his treatment with a clarity and a volume that the studio's financial projections could not ignore. Valentino, meanwhile, did not sit quietly in suspension. He had used his time away from Paramount to plan. He had connected with independent producers. He had begun developing projects that would allow him creative agency he had never been granted inside the studio system. He gave interviews, careful, measured, controlled interviews that painted a picture of a man wronged by an institution that had profited enormously from his talent, while giving him almost nothing in return. He was winning the public argument, definitively and completely. Paramount blinked. In 1923, after months of suspension and escalating public pressure, Paramount and Valentino reached a new agreement. The terms were better, modestly, carefully, grudgingly better. More money, slightly more creative input. A production schedule that acknowledged, in the most minimal possible way, that the man at its center was a human being with physical limits. It was not justice. It was a tactical retreat, by a studio that had calculated the cost of continued conflict and decided that temporary concession was cheaper than continued box office damage. Valentino declared victory. His supporters declared victory. The newspapers wrote about the Italian immigrant who had stood up to the most powerful studio in Hollywood and made them yield. But here is what history recorded that the newspapers did not. Paramount remembered. Adolf Zukor remembered with the particular, patient, cold-blooded memory of a man who had built an empire by never forgetting a slight and always waiting for the correct moment to respond to it. Jesse Lasky remembered. The studio's lawyers remembered. Every executive who had sat in those negotiating rooms and watched Valentino extract concessions from them remembered. They did not forgive. They did not accept the new arrangement as the beginning of a more respectful relationship. They accepted it as a temporary interruption, a pause in the extraction process while they waited for Valentino's leverage to diminish. And they set about ensuring that it would. The press weaponization began quietly at first. Planted stories, insinuations, the careful, deniable seeding of narratives that questioned Valentino's masculinity, his professionalism, his stability. The Pink Powder Puff editorial, published in the Chicago Tribune in 1926, which accused Valentino of corrupting American masculinity, did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a cultural environment that certain powerful interests had spent years carefully preparing. Paramount did not write that editorial, but Paramount had spent years ensuring that the soil was fertile enough to grow it. Valentino had won the battle. The kind of battle that looks like victory and functions like a trap, because winning it made him believe the machine could be reasoned with, made him believe that resistance was possible, made him trust just enough that the system which had exploited him could be reformed through confrontation. He was wrong. The machine could not be reformed, it could only be fed, and it was still hungry. Freedom, when it finally came, tasted like borrowed time. In 1924, Rudolph Valentino extricated himself from Paramount Pictures and signed with Ritz-Carlton Pictures, a smaller, independent operation that offered him something Paramount had never once considered providing: creative input, artistic collaboration, the basic professional dignity of being consulted about the work that bore his name and face and cost him his health to produce. He made 2 films under this arrangement, Monsieur Beaucaire and A Sainted Devil. Neither achieved the seismic commercial impact of The Sheik or The Four Horsemen, partly because smaller studios had smaller distribution networks, partly because Paramount's shadow over the industry made it quietly, efficiently difficult for competitors to gain the traction they deserved. But Valentino was happier, creatively engaged, breathing. Then he signed with United Artists. United Artists had been founded in 1919 by Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, artists who had looked at the studio system with clear eyes and decided that the only protection against exploitation was ownership. United Artists did not manufacture stars and extract value from them. United Artists was built by stars who had decided to extract value for themselves. For Valentino, signing with United Artists in 1925 represented the closest thing to genuine professional liberation he had ever experienced. He had creative control. He had financial participation in his film's success. He had, for the first time since June Mathies had pointed a camera at him and changed both their lives, the ability to bring his own artistic intelligence to bear on the work he was producing. He poured everything into it. The Son of the Sheik began production in 1925. It was a sequel to the film that had made him a global phenomenon, a calculated commercial decision, yes, but one that Valentino approached with complete artistic seriousness. He played dual roles, father and son. 2 characters with distinct physicalities, distinct emotional registers, distinct relationships to the camera. It was technically demanding work that required him to be on set longer, in more complex configurations, under more physically taxing conditions than a single-role production would have demanded. He delivered it anyway, because this time the work was his. This time, the creative investment had a return that went beyond a studio's balance sheet, but the body was keeping its own accounts. The filming of The Son of the Sheik ran for 88 days. 88 days of physical performance in demanding conditions, action sequences, writing sequences, emotional sequences requiring the total expenditure of his considerable psychological resources. 88 days without adequate rest, without the recovery periods that a man in his physical condition required, without anyone in his immediate professional circle with both the medical authority and the institutional power to say, "Stop. This man needs to stop." The warning signs were not subtle by the final weeks of production. People on set noticed them. Colleagues noticed them. The gaunt quality that had begun appearing in his face. The fatigue that sat behind his eyes even in moments when he was performing energy and charisma for the camera. The occasional tremor in his hands during setups. The weight loss that his costume department noted and adjusted for without anyone stopping to ask what was causing it. Nobody stopped production. Nobody called a doctor onto the set with the authority to intervene. Nobody at United Artists, despite the more humane atmosphere that distinguished the studio from Paramount, built into their production infrastructure the medical safeguards that would have caught what was happening to their most valuable star before it progressed beyond intervention. The son of the sheik rapped. It was extraordinary. It remains, a century later, one of the finest performances of the silent era, a demonstration of what Rudolph Valentino was capable of when he was given the creative space to fully inhabit his talent. And it killed him, not immediately. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that a lesser storyteller might present it. It killed him the way that chronic exhaustion and ignored physical symptoms, and a body pushed systematically past its limits always kills. Gradually, then suddenly, with a catastrophic finality that looks shocking only to people who were not paying attention. The people who should have been paying attention were not paying attention. They were looking at box office projections. They were planning the promotional campaign. They were scheduling the publicity tour that would take Rudolph Valentino, a man whose body was already in the opening stages of the crisis that would end his life, across the country to smile for cameras and shake hands and perform the performance of Stardom for audiences who deserved to see him, but who deserved, even more, to see him alive in 10 years. The tour was not optional. The tour was a financial obligation. The tour was the machine's final demand on a body that had already given the machine everything it had. Valentino boarded the train. He was 31 years old. He was the most famous man in the world. His body was failing in ways that a competent physician with access to him would have identified immediately. No competent physician had access to him. The studio had not provided one. The corporate arithmetic had been performed, and the calculation had come back with an answer that did not include a doctor on the tour. The trap had been closing for years. In August 1926, it closed completely. New York City, August 1926. The city that had ground Rodolfo Guglielmi into dishwasher work and taxi dance halls 13 years earlier, now prepared to receive Rudolph Valentino, the most celebrated screen idol on earth, for a promotional tour that the studios and distributors had scheduled with the precision of a military campaign and the moral consideration of a balance sheet. The son of the sheik needed to open. It needed to open big. It needed to generate the kind of first-week box office numbers that would justify the production costs, satisfy the distribution partners, and confirm, for the benefit of every executive who had signed off on the project, that Rudolph Valentino remained the reliable commercial force he had always been. That was the only calculation that mattered in the rooms where this tour was designed. Not his health. Not the visible deterioration that anyone who had spent time with him during the final weeks of production could not have failed to observe. Not the medical reality of a 31-year-old man whose body had been systematically pushed past its limits for 5 consecutive years without adequate recovery, without nutritional support, without the basic physiological consideration that any reasonable employer in any other industry would have been legally required to provide. The tour happened because the tour generated money. That is the complete explanation. There is no other explanation. There is no version of this story in which the men who scheduled this promotional run did not understand the risk they were accepting on Valentino's behalf. A risk they had no right to accept, a decision that was not theirs to make, a gamble played with another man's life because the potential winnings would flow to them and the potential losses would be paid by him. Consider what they knew. Consider what was knowable in August 1926 to anyone paying the most minimal attention to Rudolph Valentino's physical condition. He had lost significant weight during the production of The Son of the Sheik. This was documented. His costumers had made adjustments. The camera, which Valentino understood better than almost anyone alive, captured it in the film itself, in the slightly angular quality of his face in the later sequences, in the way light fell differently across features that had grown more prominent as the flesh behind them thinned. He was experiencing digestive distress. This was not a secret. People close to him knew it. He had been managing symptoms, pain, discomfort, the kind of persistent physical complaint that a man of his particular temperament and professional commitment would minimize in conversation and push through in practice, for months before the tour began. He was exhausted in a way that sleep was not fixing. The particular, accumulative exhaustion of a body that has been running on willpower and professional obligation long past the point where physiology can sustain it. The exhaustion that sits in the eyes and the posture and the quality of movement in ways that anyone trained to observe human beings can identify immediately. No physician traveled with him on the tour. This was a decision. A specific, deliberate, documentable decision made by people who had the authority and the resources to make a different one. A doctor on tour costs money. A doctor on tour introduces the possibility of a medical intervention that might interrupt the schedule. A doctor on tour acknowledges, institutionally, that the man at the center of the promotional campaign is a human being with a body that can fail, and that acknowledgement introduces a variable that the financial projections had not accounted for and did not want to account for. No rest days were built into the schedule. This, too, was a decision. The promotional calendar was constructed as a continuous sequence of appearances, interviews, public events, and performances of health and vitality that left no space for the recovery that Valentino's body was desperately requiring. Every day of the tour was a day of extraction. Every appearance was a withdrawal from an account that was already dangerously overdrawn. No contingency existed for illness. No protocol had been established for the scenario, the entirely foreseeable, medically predictable scenario, in which a man in Valentino's physical condition, subjected to the schedule they had designed for him, showed signs of acute medical crisis during the tour itself. The machine had built a promotional campaign. It had not built a safety net. It had not built an exit. It had not built any acknowledgement whatsoever that the human being at the center of its promotional campaign was a human being. On August 11, 1926, Rudolph Valentino arrived in New York. He completed his scheduled appearances. He smiled for the cameras. He gave the interviews. He performed the performance of a man in perfect health for an audience of journalists and fans and studio representatives who needed him to be in perfect health, and who therefore, collectively, managed not to look too carefully at the evidence that he was not. On the evening of August 14, at his suite in the Ambassador Hotel, Rudolph Valentino collapsed. He had been telling people he felt unwell. He had been telling people for days. The people he told had schedules to maintain. The people he told had box office projections that required his continued functionality. The people he told had performed the particular human talent for hearing what they needed to hear and filtering out the rest. He collapsed alone, in a hotel room, in the city where he had arrived 13 years earlier with $4 and a future that should have lasted another 40 years. The ambulance came. The hospital received him. The diagnosis that followed was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The only surprise, the only genuine, damning surprise, was that it had taken this long. Polyclinic Hospital, New York City, August 15, 1926. The doctors who examined Rudolph Valentino that morning did not need to conduct extensive tests to understand the severity of what they were looking at. The diagnosis assembled itself from the evidence his body presented with the grim clarity of a case that had been building for months and had finally arrived at its inevitable conclusion. Perforated gastric ulcer. Pleuritis. The beginnings of septic infection spreading from the perforation into surrounding tissue with the systematic efficiency of a crisis that had been given too much time and too little intervention to establish itself thoroughly before anyone with medical authority had been allowed near the patient. Let those words land properly. A perforated gastric ulcer does not appear overnight. It does not ambush a healthy body without warning. It develops over weeks, over months, from chronic stress, from inadequate nutrition, from the sustained physiological assault of a system running continuously past its capacity without the recovery periods that human biology requires in order to repair itself. It announces itself, long before it perforates, through pain, through discomfort, through the persistent, escalating physical signals that a body sends to a mind when the body needs the mind to stop and listen. Rudolph Valentino's body had been sending those signals for months. The signals had been heard and overridden by professional obligation, by personal stoicism, by the relentless forward momentum of a promotional machine that had no mechanism for processing the information that its most valuable component was failing. The pleuritis, inflammation of the lining surrounding the lungs, compounded the gastric crisis with a separate front of physiological damage, forcing his body to manage two simultaneous acute conditions with resources that a healthy, rested man would have struggled to marshal, and that Valentino, in his depleted state, could barely begin to mobilize. The septic infection was the death sentence written in biological language. Once infection enters the abdominal cavity through a gastric perforation, it moves, it spreads, it colonizes. And in 1926, 14 years before penicillin would become clinically available, in an era when the medical profession's tools for combating systemic infection were limited to surgical intervention and the patient's own immune response. A spreading septic infection in a man whose immune system had been ground down by years of chronic exhaustion represented a crisis of the most serious possible magnitude. The surgeons operated immediately. They did what they could with what they had. They were skilled. They were committed. They worked on Rudolph Valentino with every tool that 1926 medicine placed at their disposal. But here is the medical truth that the studio's subsequent press releases worked very hard to obscure. The intervention came too late, not because the doctors were slow, not because the hospital was inadequate, but because the conditions that produced this crisis had been allowed to develop, unchecked and unaddressed, for months before Valentino ever arrived at Polyclinic Hospital. Because the warning signs had been visible and had been ignored. Because no physician with authority and access had been present during the weeks and months when early intervention could have altered the trajectory of what was now unfolding in an operating theater in New York City. A doctor on the promotional tour would not have guaranteed his survival. Medicine is not magic, and 1926 is not 2026. But a doctor on the promotional tour would have identified the severity of his condition before it reached the point of perforation, would have demanded hospitalization days or weeks earlier, would have given his body the intervention it needed at a stage when intervention could still work with the patient's physiology rather than desperately against a crisis already in full acceleration. The studio had not provided a doctor. The studio had provided a schedule. In the days immediately following the surgery, the medical reports were cautiously optimistic. The operation had addressed the immediate crisis. Valentino was conscious. He was communicative. He possessed, as his doctors noted with professional admiration, a remarkable physical resilience. The resilience of a man who had been strong before the machine had spent years dismantling that strength piece by piece. He spoke to the nurses. He asked about his friends. He expressed, with the particular grace that had defined him throughout his life, gratitude for the care he was receiving. He was, in those first careful days, present, engaged, fighting. The public response to news of his hospitalization was instantaneous and overwhelming. Crowds gathered outside Polyclinic Hospital. Fans maintained vigils on the pavement below his window. Not the manufactured, studio-organized displays of public sentiment that Paramount's publicity department had spent years producing, but genuine, unscripted human grief at the possibility of losing something irreplaceable. Women wept on the streets of New York. Men who had spent years mocking Valentino's foreignness and his sensuality stood in the crowds outside the hospital with faces that said something they would not have been willing to put into words. The world understood, in that moment, what it stood to lose. The studio understood something different. While Valentino lay in his hospital bed, fighting the infection that his body's depleted resources were struggling to contain, The machine was not at his bedside. The machine was in its offices. The machine was on its telephones. The machine was calculating, with the cold, practiced arithmetic that was its native language, what his illness meant for the release schedule, for the promotional calendar, for the box office projections that had been built around the assumption of his continued functionality. The machine was managing the situation. Not Valentino. The situation. He was not a patient to be cared for. He was a variable to be managed. And the machine managed variables with the same emotional register it brought to everything else. None at all. 8 days. Rudolph Valentino fought for 8 days inside Polyclinic Hospital while the infection spread through his body with the patient, systematic thoroughness of a crisis that had been given too much of a head start to be fully turned back. 8 days during which the medical staff did everything that 1926 medicine permitted them to do. 8 days during which the nurses who attended him, women who had no financial stake in his survival, no box office projections dependent on his recovery, no promotional schedules requiring his continued functionality, provided him with the kind of consistent, present, genuinely human care that the industry that had built him had never once thought to offer. And 8 days during which Paramount Pictures and its affiliated publicity apparatus conducted a coordinated campaign of deliberate public deception that stands, even now, as one of the most cynical exercises in corporate image management in Hollywood history. The press releases began on August 16, one day after his admission, before the full extent of his condition had been communicated to his closest friends and family, before anyone outside the immediate medical team fully understood what they were dealing with. Rudolph Valentino is resting comfortably. That was the first statement, 5 words, each one carefully chosen, each one technically deniable as outright falsehood, while collectively constructing a picture of the situation that bore no relationship to the medical reality unfolding behind the hospital walls. Resting comfortably. A man with a perforated gastric ulcer, active pleuritis, and a spreading septic infection that his surgeons were working around the clock to contain was described to the world as resting comfortably. The press printed it. Because the press in 1926 did not have independent access to Valentino's medical team. Because the studio's publicists had positioned themselves as the authoritative source of information about his condition. Because the relationship between Hollywood's publicity apparatus and the entertainment press was structured in a way that made independent verification not merely difficult, but professionally inadvisable for journalists who depended on studio access for their livelihoods. The deception was not passive. It was not simply a matter of withholding information. The studio's publicists actively constructed and distributed a false narrative, a narrative in which Valentino's illness was minor, his recovery was progressing, his return to public life was imminent. On August 17, the statement read, "Mr. Valentino had a comfortable night and his condition shows improvement." On August 18, with the infection continuing to advance and his medical team privately expressing deepening concern, doctors are pleased with his progress. On August 19, as his temperature spiked and the septic crisis entered a more acute phase, Rudolph Valentino is fighting with characteristic courage and his doctors remain optimistic. Characteristic courage. They used his strength, the genuine, documented, historically verifiable strength of a man who had survived poverty and immigration and exploitation and systematic professional humiliation without breaking. They used that strength as a publicity tool. They borrowed his resilience as a narrative device to manage public anxiety, while the reality behind the hospital walls moved in a direction that optimism could not alter. Outside the hospital, the vigils continued. The crowds grew. People who had never met Rudolph Valentino stood on New York pavements through August nights, because something in them understood, with the instinctive, pre-rational knowledge that sometimes arrives before the conscious mind catches up, that what was happening inside that building was not going to end the way the press releases promised. Inside the hospital, the medical picture darkened by the hour. The septic infection had spread beyond the surgical team's ability to fully contain it. His kidneys began showing signs of stress, the particular, ominous stress of organs that have been asked to process a systemic toxic load that exceeds their functional capacity. His temperature refused to stabilize. The fluctuations themselves, the cycling between fever and apparent improvement, were not, as the studio's press releases suggested, evidence of a body rallying. They were evidence of a body in the final stages of a fight it was losing. His friends were with him. Alberto Colombo, Frank Manillo, people who had known him before the fame, before the contracts, before Paramount had decided what his face was worth. People who sat beside him not because he was a revenue stream, but because he was their friend, a man they loved, a man whose laughter they knew, a man whose history they shared. The studio sent representatives, not to comfort him, not to sit with him, to monitor the situation, to receive updates, to manage the information flow, to ensure that whatever happened next happened in a way that protected the studio's interests and the studio's image and the studio's carefully constructed narrative about the health of its most valuable asset. The representatives took notes. They reported back. They performed the function they had been sent to perform with the professional efficiency of people who understood their role. Their role was not to care about Rudolph Valentino. Their role was to manage Rudolph Valentino. Even now, even here, even in this hospital room where a 31-year-old man was losing the most fundamental fight a human being can face, the machine did not stop managing. The machine never stopped managing. That was what the machine did. That was all the machine knew how to do. On the evening of August 22, 1926, Rudolph Valentino lost consciousness. He did not regain it. Lost consciousness. He did not regain it. August 23, 1926. 3:35 in the morning. The hospital was quiet in the way that hospitals are quiet at that hour, not silent, but hushed, operating at the reduced frequency of a building that has not stopped working, but has lowered its voice out of deference to the darkness outside and the fragility of the lives it contains. Rudolph Valentino died at 3:35 in the morning on August 23, 1926. He was 31 years old. He had been unconscious since the previous evening. He did not regain awareness. He did not have a final dramatic moment of cinematic clarity in which he opened his eyes and delivered the kind of last words that biographers can quote and publicists can distribute. He simply, in the particular, devastating, undramatic way that actual death operates, stopped. His heart stopped. His breathing stopped. The infection that Paramount's promotional schedule had fed and that Paramount's absent medical care had allowed to develop unchecked, and that Paramount's press releases had spent 8 days pretending was under control, that infection completed its work at 3:35 in the morning, and Rudolph Valentino was gone. The nurse who was with him noted the time. She had been there through the night, not because anyone was paying her extra to maintain her vigil, not because a studio representative had instructed her to remain at his bedside, but because she was a nurse and he was her patient, and she understood, in the way that people who dedicate their lives to care understand, that no human being should leave this world without another human being present to witness it. She was there, she noted the time. She performed the small, essential, irreplaceable human act of being present. The studio was not present. Adolf Zukor was not present. Jesse Lasky was not present. The executives who had calculated the value of his life in box office projections and promotional schedules and contractual obligations were not present. They were in their homes, in their beds, in the comfortable distance that money and power provide from the consequences of the decisions made in the pursuit of both. The nurse was present. That distinction matters. That distinction is, in some ways, the entire thesis of this story compressed into a single human moment. In the hours that followed, the hospital issued its formal statement. Rudolph Valentino, age 31, had died of pleuritis and endocarditis, inflammation of the heart lining, resulting from the septic complications of a perforated gastric ulcer. The medical language was precise and clinical and contained, within its precision, a devastating indictment that the newspapers would spend the following weeks carefully not examining. Perforated gastric ulcers in 31-year-old men do not develop from nowhere. They develop from chronic stress, from chronic nutritional compromise, from chronic physical depletion of the kind produced by years of relentless professional exploitation without adequate recovery, without adequate medical monitoring, without adequate human consideration from the institution that had driven the exploitation. The death certificate said pleuritis and endocarditis. What the death certificate should have said, what an honest accounting of the causal chain would have required it to say, was Paramount Pictures, was Adolf Zucker, was Jesse Lasky, was the promotional tour that sent a visibly ill man across the country without a physician, because the financial projections did not include a line item for one. The news reached the world in the early morning hours of August 23. What happened next, what the world did in response to the death of Rudolph Valentino, was one of the most extraordinary public grief events in recorded history. And it stood in such complete and devastating contrast to what the studio did in response to the death of Rudolph Valentino that the juxtaposition itself constitutes an indictment. The world grieved. Genuinely, overwhelmingly, without management or orchestration or publicity strategy, the world grieved. In New York, crowds began gathering outside Campbell's funeral home before the body had been transported from Polyclinic Hospital. They gathered in the darkness of the early morning hours, these people who had never met him, who knew him only through a screen and a camera and 3 minutes of tango, and the particular gift he had possessed of making every person watching feel seen and understood and desired. They gathered, and they wept, and they stood together in the August heat, because they did not know what else to do with what they felt. By midday, the crowd outside Campbell's funeral home numbered in the thousands. By evening, it numbered in the tens of thousands. The line of people waiting to pay their respects stretched for blocks, then for miles. Police struggled to manage the volume. Windows were broken. Barriers collapsed under the weight of human grief pressing forward with an urgency that no crowd control strategy had been designed to contain. People were injured in the crush. People fainted in the August heat and were carried out and returned to the line when they recovered because leaving felt like abandonment. Women wept with the particular, unself-conscious grief of people who have lost something they did not know they could not live without until the moment it was gone. This was not manufactured sentiment. This was not a publicity campaign. This was 100,000 human beings confronting the specific loss of a specific person who had given them something genuine and irreplaceable, and who had been taken from them at 31 years old by a system that had valued his productivity over his life. They understood what had happened even if they could not articulate it in those terms. They felt the injustice even if the newspapers they would read the following morning were already working to redirect their grief away from its proper target. Rudolph Valentino lay in his casket at Campbell's funeral home in a bronze coffin that the studio had not paid for and would not pay for, surrounded by flowers sent by people who loved him and people who had destroyed him in roughly equal floral volume. And the world outside pressed forward to say goodbye to a man who should have had 40 more years. 40 more years of films. 40 more years of that extraordinary, irreplaceable gift of making a camera fall in love with him and making everyone watching fall in love through the camera. 40 more years of whatever Rudolph Valentino, the real one, the self-made one, the one who had arrived with $4